Hello, this is Ray Capote for the Misfits Mystique. Welcome, and as always, cheers. So we continue to cover this wonderful book, Mimosa, Memories of Marilyn and the Making of the Misfits by Ralph L. Roberts. And it's co-written by his nephew, Hap Roberts, and IT specialist Chris Jacobs. So to recap, Ralph Roberts was Marilyn Monroe's masseur in the late 50s and early 60s. He drives cross-country because he has a small role in Marilyn's next film, The Misfits. He arrives in Reno on July 20th, 1960. Marilyn is in Los Angeles. She's doing wardrobe tests for The Misfits. She flies up and arrives at 2:45 p.m. at the Reno airport. So they both arrive on the same day. That morning, they began shooting The Misfits. And the first scene that they shot was at the railway station with Clark Gable, Eli Wallach, and Marietta Tree. Early that afternoon, they go over to the USO building, which is the boarding house, and Eli Wallach shoots a scene with Thelma Ritter when he's inspecting the Cadillac, and Thelma Ritter walks out with the clock. They talk to supposedly Marilyn Monroe in the second story. First, Thelma Ritter saying, "Hurry up, we got to get going." Then, later on in those scenes, Eli Wallach looks up and says, I can give you a ride. I put the battery in the Cadillac because he's inspecting this Cadillac that was damaged. And Marilyn pops her head down and says, I'll never drive that car again. Those dents weren't my fault. And she'd be right down. So Marilyn arrived on the 21st, or her first scene was on the 21st. She arrived at 2:45 p.m. on the 20th. That's a Wednesday. Her first scenes were on the 21st, so she wasn't even on the set. It's possible they reshot Thelma Ritter and Eli Wallach looking up from the driveway, but I think they just edited in Monroe looking back down from the window. It doesn't make sense for them to reshoot all of that on the driveway, but we will never know. That afternoon on the 21st, the Thursday, Montgomery Clift and Kevin McCarthy arrive at the airport. So the next day, actor Kevin McCarthy does his only scene of the movie, a very short scene. He's playing Marilyn Monroe's husband in the movie, Raymond Tabor. Marilyn gets dropped off at the courthouse. She walks up the steps, and he's trying to convince her not to get the divorce. Roberts writes in his book that Marilyn introduced him to actor Kevin McCarthy, and she also introduced him to John Huston. It doesn't say, but I'm pretty sure that night when Roberts gave her a massage, she discussed with Roberts how she was good friends with Kevin McCarthy. That's why I believe it was that same night, because they shot this scene. And she said that he knew his wife Augusta when she married Arthur Miller in 1956, and then the 4 years subsequently in New York, they would have dinners out with the McCarthys, and then she discusses Nancy Walker, and then also Maureen Stapleton and Montgomery Clift. And she asked him if he knew Monty Clift, and he said, "Not too much, but I studied under his acting coach at the Actors Studio, Mira Rostova." And as you know, Roberts knew Maureen Stapleton as well. And he was giving massages to both Lee Strasberg and his wife, Paula Strasberg. And then Marilyn mentioned back to him, let me tell you sometime about my acting coach, Natasha Lytess, who was Marilyn's acting coach like the first 7 years of her career in Hollywood, roughly from around 1949 to like 1955, 56. Then Marilyn discusses how, Montgomery Clift is really nervous and he would really be interested about getting massages from you. And he said, sure, I can give him some massages. And she said she was, for whatever reason, he was concerned about how he would do in this movie. And he had never met Marilyn Monroe before, and they ended up becoming really good friends after this movie. She also discusses Roberts discusses also how Marilyn always viewed Ralph as Rafe. So you learn something new every day. I didn't know this, but in England, that's how you pronounce Ralph. That's the British way of pronouncing Ralph, is Rafe. And she always thought of him as a Rafe. And she said, do you mind if I call you Rafe from now on? And he said, yeah, sure. So after that, on one of these massages, keep in mind, Roberts talks about his friend told him to take a recorder. So he had this Wolin Sack recording machine. And it's a two-reel recorder that they had back in those days. But when he decided to write his book, roughly around 1982, this would be 20 years after Marilyn Monroe's death, he realized it was all disorganized. But he wanted to write some memoirs because he thought there was a lot of misinformation about Marilyn that had nothing to do with the person that he knew. So he is mainly going on recollection and memory and a few of the recordings that he was able to keep over the years. So Roberts discusses how on one of these sessions, Marilyn says, how was your days in Broadway? Keep in mind, Roberts, after the war, tried to follow his dreams of being an actor. He goes to New York, goes to the actor's studio. And he says, yeah, about once a year I'd do a different role on Broadway, a small part. And then I would attend a lot of the parties, a lot of plays, and do a lot of massages. And then Marilyn said, yeah, it was similar with me. So we're talking about the late 40s, early 50s. And she discusses how she would go to the actors' lab and these New York actors were out there, and she would catch their plays. And this would include Michael Chekhov, who she said was just like family to her after a while. And also Lot Gosler. Sidney Skolsky was a well-known Hollywood columnist who she became very close to. Then also Elia Kazan, director Elia Kazan, and he was an actor also. And Clifford Odette, William Saroyan, and all these wonderful actors. And she was very impressed by them because they try to push the envelope, and she always wanted to do new parts and not be pigeonholed into this bimbo blonde, which Hollywood seemed to do. And so it kind of opened up horizons, and eventually she would go to New York in the mid-50s, 55, 56, to the actor's studio. It also discusses here that Marilyn, when she was in LA, she told Roberts that, I would go into the store, and it was called Martindale's. In there, she saw a magazine called Flair. And I looked this up, and Flair was a very high-end magazine that was trying to compete with Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. And it was very expensive to produce. They had like fabric covers, and it was scented with perfume, and they had like pull-outs that in different size pages, and it was very beautiful. And she said it was very interesting to her, and just she lost herself looking through it, and she would wait every week for the next issue to come in at Martindale's, and she would thumb through it and look at all the beautiful pictures. She said it was like a different world that she hopefully one day would be in. And then sure enough, she meets the editor of Flair magazine, and this person's name was Flora Cowles. And she said, she told this person, Flora Cowles, that, you know, your magazine meant so much to me because it kept me going in those early years. And this was during the Prince and the Showgirl out in London. She met the editor. And the magazine, again, only lasted for 2 years, 1950 and 51, but she would never forget it. In fact, she said one of the issues was just all on roses. So every time she sees a rose, she thinks about Flair magazine. Then she would also say how back in New York, she was with Arthur Miller and Tennessee Williams and the famous writer, and she was discussing how, wow, look, I have these Arthur Miller and Tennessee Williams in front of me, so I'm sure I'll be in the Flair magazine someday. And it doesn't say when she said that, but in other words, she felt that she made it, where she would qualify to be in the Flair magazine. So my name is Ray Capote for the Misfits Mystique. Thank you for watching, and as always, cheers.